Good morning. I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. We don't want to take any time away from our speaker. It's a great pleasure to have Dr. Genevieve Bell here with us today. I heard her give a talk at supercomputing last year, and it was so exciting to hear about big data and some historical things that happened 1,000 years ago, I would say. And I thought, man, this is great. You know, we have a perfect example of how to apply big data to some social sciences kinds of things, and it would be a perfect opportunity for us to see if we could interest her in coming to Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Now, she's from Australia, and she works for Intel, and I thought our chances of landing her here are probably close to zero. And Becky in our office, you know, she decided that she was part of supercomputing, and she decided, well, heck, you know, she'll make a play and see if she can attract Genevieve here, and it worked. And so Genevieve actually came earlier before the Labor Day weekend, which, as you know, in Southeast Tennessee is huge. So she got to experience Booms Day on Saturday night. She got to experience the Tennessee Vols, 100,000 screaming orange fans on Sunday night. And then yesterday she went to the Museum of the Appalachia. So she is probably as well versed in Southeast culture as we are already, right, in this very short time. But Genevieve is, she got her PhD at Stanford and stayed at Stanford, and she's a anthropologist, and she has a history of anthropology in her family, and so that's her background. And from a computing perspective, did you ever think that I'd be standing up here and introducing an anthropologist, right? So, you know, one of the things at the laboratory, as we've transitioned from a big computing organization to a big computing and data organization, there are roles for big data in these kinds of social sciences which are keen to each and every one of us. And so it's exciting to have her here to talk about what she's doing as an Intel fellow stationed in Australia in this area of social anthropology and big data. And so without further ado, Genevieve, please come up and talk to us about this topic.
You get to keep that one.
Oh, I get to keep this
Yeah,
one.
I'm pretty mic'd.
All right. Mic'd up.
Wow. All right, I bet none of you thought that was the introduction you'd be hearing. Me neither. I also didn't realize when I agreed to come to Tennessee that my first encounter with all of you would be 102,455 of you screaming VOLS. But, you know, I have encountered that now, and I may never recover from it. I realize as an Intel person, all my talks need to come with a couple of caveats up front. Jeff has graciously at least tipped his hand. One of them, I'm Australian. I speak at this speed. I can't help it. You'll just have to listen faster. I'm really sorry. I've tried, but it's unsavable. Also, if you've ever heard an Intel person speak, you may be expecting a very different presentation than the one you're about to get. There are no graphs, there is no roadmap. I am not going to tell you about Xeon, E5, or anything else of that ilk, because I'm actually a cultural anthropologist. But I am enough of an Intel employee that my talk comes with a legal disclaimer. You will make no investment decisions based on what I'm about to tell you. You should invest in us because we're fabulous, not because of what I'm about to tell you. So all of that said, I thought long and hard about what I might want to talk about here, and there are many things in my kind of current day job that I'm excited about, but one of the projects that we've been working on recently in my lab has been a robot project, which is a little unusual. Intel is not in the business of robots. We are, however, in the business of thinking about how you engage the next generation of human beings with technology. And in the process of doing that, one of the projects we embarked upon was an open source robot project. So we decided to create an open source, 3D printable, downloadable, scale it as you will robot with a backstory, a science fiction compendium, and a name and a Twitter handle, because all robots should clearly be on Twitter. This is Jimmy the robot, and in the process of making him, we really decided we wanted to make an open source computing platform. Most of us in the room aren't old enough, but if you grew up in Silicon Valley, you grew up building your own computers. Most of the men I work with at Intel did so. That's part of their legacy. And we thought about the current generation of kids who aren't necessarily going to build their own computers or program in the ways that my colleagues did at Intel. And we decided it might be kind of fun to think about what would it take to engage people the way the Adair and Radio Shack and the Berkeley Computing Club did. And we figured, well, let's build a robot and let people program it and play with it as they will. So that's Jimmy. In the process of that experiment, however, I got really interested in thinking about robots, why they had such a kind of cultural resonance. Why is it that when we talk about robots, the first thing that springs to mind is Skynet going live and killing all of us? And why is it that that notion of robots as kind of dangerous is an enduring legacy? And I got really interested in thinking about what's the history here, what are the challenges, and what are the problems. And I realized as an anthropologist that part of the thing I could do was actually go look at the prehistory of robots. So for the two anthropologists in the room, that means you know what I'm talking about. For the rest of you, prehistory is a word we use in our technical vocabulary that means the history before the word. So before you wrote things down, how do you go tell a history of those things? And the fascinating thing for me about robots is the word robot didn't come into existence until 1921. And so it's a relatively recent thing, and it has a very particular legacy, and mostly that's what I want to talk about. But I realize I require a bit more of an explanation than the one I was given, partly to help you understand why I want to tell you all these things. So I'm an anthropologist by training. I have a PhD in cultural anthropology from Stanford University. I'm also the child of an anthropologist. My mother did her fieldwork in Central and Northern Australia in the 1970s and 1980s. So I spent most of my childhood living on reservations with Indigenous people who remembered what their country was like before fences and cattle and roads and whitefellas, and who at the drop of a hat would take my brother and I and go bush with them. And so I spent most of my childhood without shoes, speaking multiple Indigenous languages, killing my supper, which is excellent, and never going to school. It was like the best childhood ever. And I remain deeply grateful for Microsoft Office products because now I can spell. Really very good. My father during this period was an engineer, so were both of my grandfathers, so I kind of grew up in this really interesting world between social sciences and anthropology. My mother likes to brag. I was kicked out of my first anthropology class when I was 4.5 because I knew what matrilateral cross-cousin marriage was. My father would like to say I rebuilt my first engine when I was 5. He's not entirely telling the truth here, but I understand why they like to tell both of these stories. I was teaching at Stanford in 1998, 16 years ago, and I was very happy doing so. I had a tenure-track job. I was gainfully employed as an anthropologist, which is actually kind of a big deal. That was a good thing. My mother and my father were very happy. They're like, oh, good, you've actually done something with your life. That is excellent. And in March of 1998, I was in a bar, and I met a man, and he changed my life. This is how all Australians begin all important stories. I met a man in a bar, he changed my life. Usually for Americans, I hasten to add I didn't marry him, I didn't have sex with him, and I didn't have his children, but he changed my life nonetheless. Because he asked me one important question. He said, what do you do? And I said, I'm an anthropologist. And he said, what's that? Which was sort of disappointing, so I explained to him that I studied people and culture. He said, what do you do with that? I said, well, I'm a professor at Stanford. Very proud of myself. And he's like, couldn't you do more? I was very sad at this moment in time because truthfully being a professor at Stanford was kind of, I thought, pretty good. And I was like, what? And he's like, well, you seem interesting. It's a big compliment in the Valley. You seem interesting. He's like, you could do something more. And I'm kind of like, you're very odd. And so I left this conversation and wanted nothing more to do with this man. And the next day he called me at home, which is unusual because my mother, like I'm sure many mothers in this room and many mothers of people in this room, my mother told me not to give my number to strange men in bars. And I hadn't. And it was 1998, so this was before Facebook, Google, LinkedIn. It was before Netscape. It was before any white into which you could have typed red-headed Australian anthropologist and my name would have popped up. But Bob called every anthropology department in the Bay Area looking for me. And Stanford said, oh, do you mean Genevieve? Would you like her home phone number? Singularly not helpful. So here is Bob going, I'd like to give you a job. And I said, doing what? He's like, well, I don't know, you seem interesting. This, for me, confirmed everything that I knew about the dot-com boom in Silicon Valley, that everyone was actually insane. I was like, Bob, I don't even know what the job is. And he's like, okay, fine. But he had magic words at that point. For those of you still fresh out of graduate school, you will know what they are. He said, I'll buy you lunch. And then, sadly, I realized that, I may have gotten a PhD from a very respectable university, but I would still do almost anything for free food. It's very sad. One thing ultimately led to another with Bob, and he introduced me to the people at Intel, who similarly thought I seemed interesting, which was nice, but odd. And ultimately, I had a job interview there. They made me an offer. I turned them down. This went on for 7 months. They would call me up. I would say no. And then one day, about 15 years ago, 11 months and 2 weeks, I realized I was making a terrible mistake. My parents, in particular my mother, were very big on the notion of service with a small s, right? That, you owed it to put your money where your mouth was, to put your heart on the line for things. My mum was really big about the idea that if you could see a better world, you were morally obligated to go make it, that you should be engaged in creating a better world. And I had thought teaching was a good way to do that, and frankly, I'm sure it was. But I also wondered to myself in August of 1998 whether teaching was going to be the best way I had to change the world. And I realized here was Intel, a company that seemed to be in the middle of the largest technological transformation of my life, and possibly of many ours. And I thought, do I want to leave that entire conversation about what that future should be up to engineers? I know, you're all very nice people, but I did worry. And I realized that maybe an anthropologist in that mix might be a good thing. And if nothing else, it would certainly be a big challenge. And tenure was not shaping up to be a big challenge, it was just shaping up to be a big grind. And so I called Intel back and said, when can I start? And they're like, well, 2 weeks. Okay, good. So I quit everything, I moved to Oregon, I turn up at this new job, my second day in the office, because the first day they tell you how not to kill yourself in the factories. My second day in the office, my new boss sat me down and said, great, you're here, we need help with 2 things. Like, excellent, what are they? My new boss said, women. I was like, well, you don't have any. She said, no, we need to understand what women want. I'm like, which women? She's like, all women. Like, all 3.2 billion? Yes, my new boss says, that would be great. Help us understand all 3.2 billion women. I'm like, okay. So in my notebook of the day, I write down women all and underline it a lot. And try to imagine what is the project you will do to explain women all to what I understood at that point was a microprocessor company. So there's several disconnects, right? And as I'm thinking about what the project is, which for those of you who are researchers, the moment when you get that kind of project scope, it's kind of exciting, right? You're like, okay, women all, cool. I realized that my boss had said there were 2 things. And if the first thing is women all, it is terrifying to imagine what number 2 might be. I think I secretly hoped it would be men, because that would round out the equation. But my new boss says, okay, the second thing is ROW. We have an ROW problem. Like, okay, what's ROW? I helpfully say. My new boss says, that's rest of world. Okay, so to recap, I then say, so where is world in this sentence? My new boss says, that's America. It's like, okay, good. So that to understand my task at hand here is to understand everyone who basically isn't in the building. That's what you'd like me to do, is to explain to you all the people that aren't in the building to you? My boss said, that'd be great. I'm like, it's like, okay, I reckon I have a job for the rest of my life or until I go crazy. So for 16 years today, my job at Intel has been to explain everyone who isn't in the building to everyone who is in the building. It has taken many forms. It has been about how do you use ethnographic and other forms of social science research to deeply understand what people care about, what motivates them, what frustrates them, what pisses them off, what they secretly wish for, what they want for their families, themselves, their communities, their countries, and to use all of that for next generation technology development. And in my role at Intel, we have done all manner of research that way that has driven new transformations all the way down to silicon. I can actually trace a line from our ethnographic work to IP blocks on our SoCs and even on our mainline microprocessors from the 2007 generation onward. And we are currently scoping what our 2023 technology will look like. I'm not going to talk about any of that, though. That's just the tease that says I get to do good work. In the rest of my life at Intel, in addition to paying attention to people, I also get to pay attention to the stories we tell about technology. Because it turns out the stories we tell about technology are almost as important as the technology itself. The ways we talk about technology, the things that we want from it, the ways we fear it, the expectations we put on it, all of that is also about how we shape the future. And so part of my job is how you do this thing that I would call charting the sociotechnical imagination, so that space in between what we talk about and what the technology actually does. And there are lots of ways you can think about this. I've just pulled 2 off Twitter because they're kind of fun. William Gibson, we know who William Gibson is? Some of you do, good. Premier science fiction writer. Much of his work helped frame the way we think about big data and arguably the internet. William Gibson recently put on Twitter that he woke up entirely in a world, woke up from a dream that was entirely taking place in Google Street Views. So the technology has sunk into his psyche and is now shaping the way he thinks about the world, which is kind of delightful, right? Of course it will. Ultimately, that is exactly what will start to happen. The second one is my favorite follow on Twitter these days, which is a person who is tweeting, I assume it is a person who is tweeting as a Roomba that has got sentience. So for those of you who don't know, the Roomba is the largest robot install on the planet currently. There's about 10 million of them in circulation, literally in circulation. It makes them the biggest robot install base of anything. The guys who were building it recently, in conversations with some of my colleagues and I said, we thought we were building robots, but we're just building vacuum cleaners. Like, we spend a lot of time worrying about dirt and dust and brooms. I'm like, good, better robots, better vacuum cleaners. But this person who tweets as this robot's inner life is a constant monologue on Twitter. In this particular instance, this robot has decided that the radio is attempting to communicate with it in some way. And it imagines that the robot is trying to tell, the radio is trying to tell it something. So this particular kind of piece here imagines what will happen when technical objects have an inner life, right? Well, it turns out it's not particularly exciting. More fun was this. So this turned up on YouTube about 2.5 years ago when Siri first came out. Someone staged a conversation between a Furby, you all remember Furby, yes, and Siri. 47 seconds of the best HD video there is to have on the internet, because the Furby says, as Furbies do, and the Siri says, I cannot find Graham in your address book. And the Furby goes, and the Siri says, would you like me to look up Shell Oil? It's excellent. And there is 45 seconds more of that, right? And it's delightful, and I thought it was very funny. And I watched it multiple times. And I came into my office, and I made my engineers watch this, and they're like, that's nice. Why are you doing this to us? And I'm like, listen, because I think there's a couple of things going on in this. Like, what? I'm like, well, it's a kinship diagram, right? It's granddaddy talking thing to grandbaby talking thing. It's talking things from 15 years ago to current talking things. There is clearly a transformation here in talkiness. They're like, uh-huh. And then I said, well, I did archaeology as an undergraduate, and in graduate school I said, it's also a tree of humanity, sort of like the tree of man, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals. I was like, but look, this is an evolution diagram too, because in the top half, it's a talking thing. 15 years later, it is a talking and a listening thing. And the listening is important, right? Because there is a difference between talking and listening. Some of you even know it, because listening actually requires paying attention to someone else. And by the time you get to listening, it also necessitates that there's some kind of relationship, right? You listen to people, and there is a form, at some level, of social reciprocity that goes on. When someone tells you something, you listen, you make nodding that suggests that there you are listening. And I said, I think what we have here is the beginning of a paradigm shift. We are moving from human-computer interactions, which are command and control, to human-computer relationships, which will be more proactive, where these objects might decide to listen to us because they care. At which point my engineers went, no. Just flat out no. I'm like, what do you mean no? They're like, no. I'm like, why no? They're like, listen, if the thing will care about it, you know what happens next? I'm like, I have no idea. They're like, listen, if it can care about us, it will kill us. I'm thinking to myself, you're not that bad a human being. And then I realized that what had happened is in their heads, they had gone from Furby to Siri to the Terminator. Like in one easy swoop. And that we couldn't imagine sentience in a technology without also imagining that we would die. And that to me was fascinating. Why does that link exist? And I started to realize that one of the things that we have as human beings, culturally speaking, is a fascination with objects and what it means for those objects to come to life. All of our major religious systems, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, as well as lots of minor religious systems, are fascinated and completely framed around the idea of making things come to life. Whether it's God making Adam and Eve come to life, unsubstantiated matter, breathing into them, giving them a soul, making them human, whether it is about the stories of God's creating humans as their playthings, turning themselves into human beings. There is endless stories that run through most of our major religious traditions and indeed most of our mythologies about what it means to make life and about who gets to do it, what are the rules associated with it, and what are the costs, because there are always costs. When you make life, that life doesn't always do what it's told. Genesis is the paradigmatic story of life being made and not doing exactly what it was told. Stay in this garden, don't eat the fruit. Oops. Get kicked out of the garden. Series of stories about that, right? Where people make life and the life takes on effectively a life of its own and does things it should or it shouldn't do, but it doesn't always follow the rules. Lots of stories about making life and about the consequences of it. The most important one, it turns out, for our consciousness, for the way we think about technology, is actually one that has its origins about 500 years ago, and it comes out of Judaism. So mystic Kabbalism, but in particular in this instance, out of the Jewish traditions from Czechoslovakia, from the town we now know as Prague. There is a set of stories that were published in the early 1800s and then again translated into English in the early 1900s that tell the story of a golem. This is a classic representation of the golem. In the most famous story about the golem is made out of clay from the riverbed in the city of Prague by Rabbi Lowy. He and two of his senior leaders in the Jewish faith circle around this body of mud in the river, calling a particular set of names, and on the seventh turn, this body comes to life out of the riverbed and is a misshapen human being, about 7 feet tall. They dress him in clothing so that he mostly passes. And over a period of time, he protects the Jewish enclave in Prague from the traditions of anti-Semitic governments, of kings who have not the best intents of this community in mind, and of various cranky Catholic priests. This golem doesn't ever break from what he is supposed to do. He only does what he is supposed to do. But in the end, there are a series of stories told about what happens when this golem gets out of control, doesn't do what he is supposed to do, and there is a set of myths and legends that come up around this golem figure, right? Breathed into life, acts like a human being, can think in some stories, can talk in some stories, cannot. But ultimately lumbers through this community and set of communities, on the one hand protecting people, but on the other hand seen as being deeply, deeply dangerous. The stories about Golem turn up in English in 1917, but by the time they'd gotten there, they'd already been absorbed through the Grimm brothers, who tell a story of this, and they turn up in a whole series of our folk traditions about the idea of bringing something large and unexpected to life. In this particular instance, he is brought to life by the letters of God literally emblazoned in his forehead, and you need to hold that because there are other technologies that will appear later that do that, right? But the stories of making life are hugely important, and they run through at least the first 1,500 years of the Western tradition, and arguably as long in others. By the time you get to the 1700s, however, you stop just telling stories because a whole series of technologies that make it possible to imagine bringing inanimate things to life start to come to the fore. Electricity, early experiments, mostly with frogs, not good for the frogs. You start to be able to think about early battery technology. We start to have scalpels appear, so we start to be able to dissect things. You have early ways of holding electricity and electricity generation. You have, most importantly, at the beginning of all of this, watch and clock technology. Not very sexy, but self-propelling. When you wind up a clock, it keeps ticking all by itself for quite some time, or it did before we were in the digital age. Those of you who are my age who remember when you wound watches and wound clocks. Yes, some of you please nod. Yes, you remember this. Okay. So there was a period of time when clocks came along, and that was good because they told time, and that was pretty exciting. But, you know, everyone wanted a clock, and ultimately we had a surplus of clockmakers. Who knew? Early 1600s, lots of clocks, surplus of clockmakers, surplus of watchmakers, surplus of people who knew how to tinker with small metal bits. Creates a whole new industry that doesn't exist before, right? And starts to push this idea of making things come to life from story into fact. And the first big ones are the automaton period, starting in the early 1600s, really through to the 20th century, but with their big explosion in the 1700s. Was people who worked out how to take things that wound up clocks and put them in other things and make them come to life. Lots of different automaton technology, most of it kind of ideas of the spectacular and also of the kind of the lots of trickery and fakery, right? So lots of little things made to almost resemble other things. So little tiny children who could play violins, little tiny dancing things. There's some quite famous ones that come out of India in the 17 and 1800s that are really quite spectacular. But my favorite of them is this one here. This is called Le Canard Digesteur, or the digesting duck, by a man named Jacques de Vaucanson. This one was built in the mid-1700s and turned up on the stages and courts of Europe in 1736. This is really important because it's the first automaton that's made to look like the thing it resembles. So it was really duck-like. Now, I'm assuming because I am in East Tennessee, you people have all seen ducks. This is good. In Santa Clara, not so much. I had to explain ducks recently, and I was kind of disturbed by that. I'm like, what do you mean you've never seen a duck? I'm like, how hard is this? Ducks? And they're like, nah, no ducks. I'm like, okay, fine. So this is, duck size, right? So it walks like a duck. It's got 400 metal pieces in it. So it walks like a duck, foot over foot, so it waddles. It has a separated beak, so its beak goes clickety-clickety-clack. Vaucanson, first person to use vulcanized rubber to make the digestive tract in this duck, because he wanted the duck to digest, and he wanted it to make the digesting sound, which involves gurgling, so he ran water through metal pipes and they rusted. And so he decided he needed something else. Vulcanized rubber had just turned up in France. He gets the very first pieces of it and works out how to basically extrude pipes to make the interior of this duck. Now, you have been around ducks. You know if they eat and they waddle and they digest and they gurgle, what do you imagine comes next? They defecate. That's very good. They do, they defecate. Now, what's delightful is, of course, in 1736, he couldn't actually work out how to make digestion happen, but he could work out how to fake it spectacularly. So I like to imagine there was an intern or a postdoc who had to do this, but this duck had a reservoir in it of pre-cached shit. So someone went to get real duck, stuck it in the reservoir in this duck, and so this duck ate, waddled, and pooed across the stages of Europe. This duck was a revelation in all kinds of ways because it was the first time people had able to mechanically reproduce life. Voltaire said of this duck, without this duck there was no glory for France. This may say more about Voltaire and France than it does about this duck. Nonetheless, Vaucanson is onto something, right? He understands that you can take contemporary technologies and make a thing that looks alive. And the prize here, the thing that made this duck really popular, was that it seemed lifelike. It did all the things ducks did. Walk like a duck, talk like a duck, chat like a duck. It was really good, right? It was duck-like. And the prize here became about simulacrum and verisimilitude, right? About how did you make things look real. Unsurprisingly, this duck also disturbed people because it looked really duck-like, and it did it all by itself. So there was something here about this slippage between delightfulness and mild anxiety. Because was it doing it by itself? And if so, what did that mean? Could you make a metal duck be like a real duck? Clearly he has a sleight of hand to do that, but obviously there's something going on here. Vaucanson goes on to be instrumental in the creation of Jacquard loom technology, which of course gets us to early computation. So he is a bridge straight from wind-up technology to computation via ducks. Now, what's fascinating is the very same technology ends up in other places doing something completely different. So where in Europe the prize is for similitude, that same technology, literally the same technology, watch taken apart, ends up in the hands of a man named Tanaka, who is the kind of, sometimes described as the Edison of the Japanese court, but was basically the chief engineer of the Emperor of Japan, an excellent gig if ever there was one. Got these clocks, decided he would take them apart, reverse engineer them, worked out the windy bit inside was interesting, and created a series of what are known in Japan as Karakuri, often translated into English as robots and automatons, but they're not really. This is the most famous of them. It's a teacup Karakuri. It's about this big. It has a cup in its hand. When you put the cup in its hand and the cup is full, it runs across the tea table, bows. You take the teacup and it runs away again. Clearly, this is not what human beings do on coffee tables, right? So there's nothing about this that is making something that looks real. It's about making something that is magical and beautiful. But it's also about making something come to life in a culture where there are all kinds of ideas about things being animated that aren't human. So in a culture where there is all kinds of animism, so ideas about things being alive, it makes perfectly good sense that you would make this form of magic, right? Puppets come alive, have to be buried in cemeteries at the end of their existence. Having a Karakuri that runs across a tabletop to deliver a teacup makes pretty good sense, right? But it's the same technology with a slightly different trajectory. By the time you get into the 1800s, it's clear that electricity has gone from being an experiment to being more of an experiment. You've had all the transformations at the back end of the 1700s. You've started to have a whole lot of other things appear in the conversation and in the ether. And a young woman named Mary Shelley writes what is the kind of English first appearance of the golem story in a book called Frankenstein. Now, the backstory to this book is kind of remarkable, right? She and her boyfriend of the time are in Europe on vacation with Byron. You may remember him, poet. A man whose girlfriend of the day described him as mad, bad, and dangerous to know, which sounds like a delightfully modern epitaph. Could be on Hello Magazine. So Byron is there, Percy Shelley, romantic poet, Mary's not yet then husband. Mary's half-sister, who is trying to get in bed with Byron. Byron's doctor and some other hangers-on. So this should sound like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, because frankly, this was the kind of scandal celebre of the day. These guys were, incredibly well followed. And in the middle of a very long, protracted summer that was mostly dark and bleak because a volcanic eruption had filled the air with dust, and so there was never any sun that summer, Byron declares, in the way the English aristocracy can only do, that he is frightfully, frightfully, frightfully bored, and someone must surely make him feel something again. And so he challenges everyone to go write a story to make him feel something. And that night, 3 of our most important tropes of horror get authored, right? The first vampire story, the first zombie story, and of course, Frankenstein. Now, this story is important for lots of reasons, not in its details or its delightful, proto-Victorian purple prose, though if you haven't read it recently, you should. What is remarkable about it is it is the story that is the touchstone for the next 200 years. It is a story about what happens when you make life and that life doesn't follow the rules. Because in this story, for those of you who are not paying attention in high school or university or to every movie that has come since about this particular subject, Victor Frankenstein decides he is going to make a creature. He stitches together pieces of human beings, mostly gathered from cemeteries and other forms of not very nice necrotism, puts a brain in it, not the abnormal brain, although that is the best Frankenstein story ever, and brings it to life with electricity, i.e. the technology of the day, right? It is electricity that is the substitute for the pulse. It is electricity that brings the thing to life. And of course, Frankenstein's monster, because the monster is not called Frankenstein, Frankenstein's monster lumbers into being, attempts to learn how to be human. Human beings reject it. And what does it do? It turns around and tries to kill us. That story, that notion of the moral imperative of making life, of it going wrong, haunts us to this day. Not literally, but figuratively. Because this is the story that sits underneath all the other stories. This is what James Cameron is riffing on when he talks about the Terminator. This is why every time someone says to you, oh, we're making this genetically modified food, we all go, nothing good will come of it. It's because lurking in the back of our subconscious is this story. Because it hasn't been out of print since the book was published. It has been the subject of more movies and more films than you can begin to imagine. So even as we sit in temples of science and industry, this story inhabits our imaginations and you can't check it at the door. And it continues to be a hugely important one. Of course, that didn't stop people from trying to do stuff. All the way through the 1800s, as electricity mainstreams, as new forms of technology appear, the steam engine in particular, people try to work out how to take and harness that technology and make the next generation of things. This is my favorite patent from the back end of the 1800s. This is someone trying to work out how to make a technology walk using a steam engine. Now, you can imagine visually this was very silly. Huge steam engine, man walking in front of it. Mostly steam engine pushing man walking in front of it, but the illusion was that the man should look like it was walking. Sometimes they would drape the steam engine in cloth so you couldn't see it. This seems insane given the size of the steam engine versus the human being. But they're trying to solve what many of you know is one of the hardest problems actually in technologies of making the body, which is walking. Walking turns out to be really quite complicated. This didn't get there, but it starts to suggest that they've now fragmented the body into pieces, right? Okay, what's the new technology? How do we harness it? How do we do something interesting? And of course, all those experiments continue. all the way through the early 1900s. And then World War I happens, 100 years ago now. And World War I changes the game in terms of technologies. It is the first mass-produced war. It is a war with industrialization at its heart. It is a war where new technologies come to the fore, and the scope and scale of them are remarkable. It's also a war that drives incredible and profound social change around the world. For better or worse, the consequences of World War I also unleash conversations about labor relations, about trade unions, about forms of emancipation of different populations. So the women's movement in the suffragette form in the West is particularly powerful during this period of time. So all kinds of social unrest and ferment happen in this period. And all kinds of new technologies are just lurking on the horizons, right? We've got early experiments in radio. Certainly the telegraph has already happened. In the United States, electricity is already in most people's homes. Not in Australia or England, but certainly here. There's more than just the light bulb, right? And television isn't that far away. Movies have already started. So there's all this new technology that lets you distribute ideas and thinking, and technology that starts to suggest very different ways of being in the world. And it's in that incredible ferment that a man named Karel Čapek is born and will write what is one of the most important works in thinking about robotics, unexpectedly. He's a playwright, he's a poet, he is an avant-garde artist, he's the child of a physician. He is a sickly youth, so he doesn't end up fighting in World War I, but most of his friends fight and die. He goes on to be a political activist and a radical. He is radicalized by the war and by what he sees in it. He edits papers and all sorts of things in Prague. He clearly reads Gollum when it is republished in 1917. And in 1921, he finishes a play called Rossum's Original Robots, and that play goes on stage for the first time in Prague on January 27th, 1921. And it is a play that is pretty familiar. There's a man named Rossum, he has a factory, it makes robots. So far you're with me, right? Okay, good. The robots turn out to be these quasi-biological hybrid between human beings and metal. Their maker gives them a 25-year lifespan. This should start to sound increasingly familiar. A 25-year lifespan doesn't really give them any sense of how to be happy. They take over most of the world, and in the last act of the play, they come back, find their maker, and demand the secret to how to live longer and how to have a soul and be happy. You will recognize that story from things that follow. The word robot is dragged into this play by Čapek and his brother because they're looking for a word to describe these things. They try android, it doesn't quite work. Cyborg wasn't really a winner either. Robot is a word in Czech, robota, that means many things, but the connotation is of serf, so of slave, of bonded labor, of a particular kind of drudgery, of a particular kind of labor, right? So the word is designed in Czech, where this play appears, as it appears in Czechoslovakian, is designed as a critique, right? This is a critique about mass industrialization, about what it would mean to have Fordist factories, about the fact that it's this, giving up your soul at some level, right? And in the play, one of the things that is said by one of the protagonists, they talk about that what Rossum has done is invented a worker with a minimum amount of requirements. He had to simplify him. He rejected everything that didn't contribute directly to the progress of the work. He had rejected everything that made man more expensive. In fact, he rejected man and made the robot. The robots aren't people. Mechanically, they're more perfect than we are. They have an enormous developed intelligence, but they have no soul. Have you ever seen what a robot looks like inside? Very neat, simple, really a beautiful piece of work. Not much in it, but everything in flawless order. The product of an engineer is technically at a higher pitch of perfection than the product of nature. So already, right, setting up the scope. Now, astonishingly, this play could have just languished in Prague, but it didn't, because Čapek was a name on the global stage, and because this play resonated in ways that people couldn't entirely articulate. It turns up on Broadway in New York in 1922 to rave reviews from the New York Post. The New York Times not so impressed. The New York Times says the robots are far less creepy than Frankenstein and don't really pass muster as a good monster. Excellent. Prove the New York Times not entirely accurate. Maybe the paper of record, but not always right. It goes on a run of a very long time. 1923, it turns up in the West End in London. 1924, it's in Tokyo. 1925, it's in Sydney. This play does the rounds, and it stays in production through the 30s and 40s. Let me see if I got it right. Bogart got his first start playing one of the robots in this play. The second Doctor Who, similarly, in England. The play goes on to be the first piece of science fiction broadcast on a radio station, because the BBC played an excerpt of it in 1928. It goes on to be one of the first pieces of broadcast science fiction, because the BBC put it on their television station in 1939, 1940. So it's instrumental in shaping the science fiction imagination early, right? And the word robot has this really interesting resonance and clearly anchors the play. And of course, it has that resonance because there's hundreds of years of people trying to do exactly this, right? The reason robot works, the reason it comes out of the literary imagination and lands firmly with all of us, is that it ties together all these other stories, right? It's about the automatons, it's about the wind-up things, it's about Frankenstein and Golem, and all that stuff just kind of gets bundled up. And then people try to make it. It's completely excellent. First, mechanicalized robot, 1928, England, made by a man named Richards. The robot's name is Eric. I love the English. They named their robot Eric. Eric was made to open the Motor Engineering Society annual conference in Sandringham in 1928 because the Duke of York turned them down. Pause and think about that for a moment. You couldn't get a royal, so you made a robot. This robot is about 6 feet high. He doesn't walk, because clearly that's still a fairly difficult problem. He stands on a box in which there is like a 12-volt battery. Very important, so all the power is in the box. He has blue eyes. He has RUR, which you can't really see in this room, emblazoned on his chest, so making clear the legacy, right? They're already calling him one of Rossum's original robots, so you know exactly who he is. And he bows incessantly. So whenever he says anything, he bows a lot. I'm like, oh God, you made an English robot. He's great, he bows all the time. He's incredibly polite and compliant. The New York Times liked him a lot because he came to America shortly thereafter. They said he was very polite and very charming in the way the English can be. Who even knows what that means? You're like, okay, good. So the English make a bowing, scraping, mechanical robot, very metal. The English newspapers at the time talk about the fact that he looks a lot like a knight, right? They kind of understand the legacy too, right? The Japanese counter with this. In 1929, its name is, I never get the name right, it's many vowels, Gaku Tensuku, designed to be a robot of nature. He has a mechanical bird as a friend, who when he lights on his shoulder, he closes his eyes. He has a mechanical pen that he writes with. He's 10 feet high. He's pneumatically driven, so the power in him, if the power in the English one is a battery, the power here is air being pumped through a series of pumps. He is quite spectacular. He is on display 1929, 1930 in Japan. Everyone comes and sees him. In 1931, he goes on tour in Germany and is mysteriously lost. I cannot work out how you lose a 10-foot-high pneumatically driven robot, but apparently he was. I think there's a serious crowdsource activity here to go find this original robot because he's quite remarkable, right? And clearly here, again, this is this notion of mechanization, but with a very different intent. Oh, and then there is America. Bless you all. So Westinghouse decides this whole mechanical robot thing looks like a really good lark. They're already doing voice-controlled system automation, so it's an early voice control for controlling water plants and things, so voice down the wire. They'd already worked out how to do various forms of. And so they make a first really bad attempt in the 1920s. This is their second attempt. His name is Electro. He is 7.5 feet tall. He runs mostly with an extension cord, but he can in fact walk. He, in fact, can dance, because that's particularly good. Because he is an American robot in the late 1930s, he also smokes cigarettes, because he has bellows in his head, which also means he can blow up balloons, and he does both, not at the same time. He talks. He has basically a record player stacked inside his belly, so a series of, he can talk about 850 words through a voice recognition, early voice command system, basically. The voice triggers a number, which triggers a record inside him that then plays, right? He turns up at the World's Fair in 1939. The New York Times doesn't like him terribly much. The Post does. He ends up in a bunch of movies. His last known movie was Sex Kittens Go to College in 1950. I know, and then he was mysteriously lost. Again, there's a theme here. He went missing from the 1950s and was recently found as early, I think he was found in the late 1990s, where his head was being used as a beer opener on someone's coffee table in Pittsburgh, and his entire body was put back together again and is now on display. He's kind of delightful at several levels. He calls everyone toots, and he's dreadfully rude. Which is mostly what all of the newspapers say about him, is that he embodies the worst of the jitterbug age, is the critique of him. Like, fabulous, right? So first 3 attempts of making robots. And what they immediately make clear is what all of the problems are going to be for everyone moving forward, right? Problem number 1 is this. Hollywood just takes this and runs, because it is really clear this is going to be a big winner, right? This story has real resonance, so do robots. This is just a selection of the robot movies I have in my house. I'm sure many of you have others. I'm sure you all have ones you love more, so don't get cranky about the fact that your favorite is not on here. But there is a whole series of movies about robots. They mostly follow a predictable set of arcs. None of them is new here, right? But Hollywood makes it all look pretty easy. You know, with the exception of, well, you know, yeah, there's a number of them. But, you know, for the most part, Hollywood has solved the problems that will plague actual roboticists. Hollywood just makes it all relatively simple. But the problems, and of course, in so doing, in making it look simple, they teach all of us to have a much higher expectation than the technology can ever deliver. And they also continue to reproduce a set of stories that are mostly about fear. There are very few stories about happy robots out there. You know, if they're happy, they'll become sad later. If they're happy, it's because something in them is broken and they don't have any friends. I mean, most successful robot stories involve robots going mad and killing you. And I know Asimov's 3 laws of the robot. Here's the thing you need to know about that. In order to have 3 laws of the robot, something must have happened first. So, you know, that is a predicate on the fact that you're trying to control something. So my sense is there are 4 problems, right? There is the problem of bodies. How do you resolve the fact that science fiction and all of the literary images make it look really easy? Like, robots should just be able to walk and talk. It's pretty straightforward, right? But the walking piece, hugely difficult. The body piece, somewhat hard. If you do an inventory of the humanoid robots that were made between Eric and about 1980, there's about 150 of them globally that are full scale. 2 of them are women. Only one of them, which was really interesting, one of them is tagged, it's from the 1930s, is tagged as Negro robot. Now, the fact that it says that makes it immediately clear that all the others are not. So we have an interesting racing and gendering of robots. This one is an early Japanese robot from the 1930s. You will notice, if you could look at it clearly, it has almond-shaped eyes. So here the robot is clearly Japanese. So one of the things we do with robots is reproduce the maker, right? I mean, it's what fiction already tells us, but it's true in science, fact also. Unsurprising that there aren't that many female robots. There aren't that many female robot makers, and mostly make male robots. And when they make female robots, it isn't helpful. So we have a body problem. We have a question about purpose, right? What are you going to do with this robot? Like, what's it going to do? What does it have to do? You don't get to fully useful mechanical robotic arms until the 1960s and 1970s out of places like SRI at Stanford. You start to get some mechanized arms for doing things. But there is an open question about what will the robots be. Is it just a piece of a robot? So think of the mechanical arms in car factories. Is it a vacuum cleaner? What's it going to do? Is actually a surprisingly difficult question. And in the humanoid robot space, we have a series of really open questions about what these things are going to be. Are they going to be substitute human beings? Because that's a problem. Are they going to care for human beings? That only works in some cultural contexts. Are they going to be efficient and helpful, a la Rossum's original robots? That's good, but has other problems attached to it. I know from our robot project, we didn't make him be able to do anything except sing and dance and tell jokes, and people were horrified. They're like, you have a social robot. We're like, yes. They're like, well, what does it do? We're like, it's social. I'm like, that isn't good enough. I'm like, ooh, okay. So there's some interesting notions about what we imagine the technology is going to do, right? What is its purpose? What do we imagine it needs to deliver on? Because frankly, that shapes what the body is, but it also shapes what the technical agenda is and what the acceptance will be and where it needs to go. The third question is, if you make it autonomous, well, presumptive question, does it need to be autonomous? And if so, what does autonomy look like accompanied by sentience? my favorite sign from a Japanese fieldwork trip I did recently. I saw it out of the corner of my eye and had to get out of a car to go photograph it, the joys of being an anthropologist. And my colleagues followed me and went, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "This sign is amazing." And they're like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "What does it say?" They're like, "It says robot zone." I'm like, okay. "What does it say in Japanese?" They're like, "Oh, this is an autonomous robot zone. There are robots 2 meters in from the curb." I'm like, "Whose robots?" Like, "Well, they're autonomous." I'm like, "Yes, but who do they belong to?" "They're autonomous." Like, "What are they doing? They're 2 meters in from the curb." "Aren't you concerned?" "No, that's what the sign is for." And this went on for some time, with me getting increasingly agitated and my colleagues just looking at me like, "What is your problem today?" And I finally go, "But seriously, whose robots?" They're like, "They're autonomous." I'm like, "Well, they have to belong to someone." I'm like, "Well, but we don't care who they belong to." Like, "Aren't you concerned?" "No, that's what the sign is for." Like, but there are these robots just running wild. They're like, "No, they're 2 meters in from the curb." Deep breath. And I'm like, "Okay, aren't you concerned the robots will try and kill you?" Because sometimes you just got to put it right out there. And my colleagues look at me and go, "Don't be ridiculous, that's just American science fiction. Our robots are very friendly." Like, okay, good. So you have this question of autonomy, right? Will the robots be sentient? And if they will, what will that look like? And how will you manage and engineer it, right? Because that's actually incredibly difficult. So 3 orders of problems, right? What will it do? What will it look like? What will it think? Or will it think? Huge, critically hard technical problems. And then the last one is, if you've done all of it, it has a body, it has a purpose, and it has a mind, what's it going to be thinking? And should we be worried? Because clearly science fiction has taught us robots will only think 2 things. Kill John Connor. And I've seen starships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. You know, I've seen Seagate sparkle at Tannenhouse Gate. We know exactly what robots will think. It's those 2 things. Now, of course, roboticists will tell you something different. One of the premier Japanese roboticists of his day, indeed to this day, has this extraordinary book where he basically argues that robots will be better Buddhists than human beings will, because robots are capable of infinite patience and thus infinite grace, and that they will be able to find their way to Buddhism in a way that it's much harder for human beings. He also argues that if you are concerned that the robot is going to rise up and kill you, that says much more about you than it says about the robot, as ultimately you are the one who programmed the robot. So really what you are reflecting is your own fear, not the robot's fear, so you should stop putting it all on the robot. She says that's kind of unreasonable. What you have running through this, for me, though, is the question of purpose, the question of bodies, the question of autonomy, and the question of thought are ultimately not just questions about robots, right? These are questions about all technology that we engage in. What's it for? What does it look like? What's it going to do? And how much independence will we give it? Are ultimately questions that frame most technological endeavors. These are as true for apps and services and arguably phones and computers as they are for robots. And that ultimately the same anxieties that we have about robots run through all these other technologies too. Because it is my suspicion in all of this that the stories about making robots, the pieces of making robots, those aren't just technical challenges, right? Every time you make a robot, you're not just making a piece of technology, you're also making culture. You're making aspirations, you are making, well, the business of who we all are in the world. And it is almost impossible, even if you wanted to, it is almost impossible to separate out where we came from and the things that influence and shape us from the work we do. And for me, there's something to be said about actually surfacing them and owning them. It's fine that Frankenstein and Gollum run through our subconscious. It's good if we would recognize that as part of the reason why every time someone says drones, we go death. Because those things aren't natively linked, right? They are linked through culture. And there's something for me about thinking about the history of robots that is also a way about thinking about the history of technology. The same stories you tell here about Eric and Ganku Seko and Electro are the stories we could tell about early computing. They're the stories we can tell about the internet. They're the stories we can tell about, well, frankly, Friendster and Facebook, because ultimately they are part and parcel of the same things. Substitute bodies for form factors and UI, substitute purpose and autonomy for questions about big data, algorithms, and analytics, and it's the same conversation we keep having, right? So for me, there's something really powerful about what it means to know our history, not just in our disciplines, but the history of the technologies in our lives, the stories that we tell about them, and about why knowing those stories are sometimes also really powerful ways of doing things differently moving forward, or frankly just owning that once you made a robot that smoked, which is kind of marvelous, right? Because it was the 1930s and that's what robots did. There's something in all of this about having those pieces of our history be part of our contemporary consciousness, because I think it makes us better human beings, but also ultimately better scientists. I think there's something about knowing where your discipline came from, about knowing its preoccupations, about knowing its failures and its early ancestors, of knowing what we would call its prehistory, that ultimately make you better at your job right now. And I know that means more work, and sometimes we don't want to think about the history because it weighs us down. But I think there's something about knowing where we came from and knowing the questions we have asked in the past and knowing that sometimes those questions sound and look really different in different places, that the robots are our friends is a very different articulation than kill John Connor. And there's something for me about being able to move between all of those conversations that is really powerful. And so if that is the one thing I leave you with today, I leave you with that, is go and think about what is your history and how you own it and make it part of what you do now, because I think it makes us better scientists. So with that, I say thank you.
We have about 5 minutes for a few questions if you have a few.
Oh, and the first question can't be, that was really interesting, but what do you actually do?
So thank you very much. In coming to Oak Ridge, I wonder if you thought about nuclear science and technology.
Mm-hmm.
There was a version of your lecture given here in 1976 in a celebration of the bicentennial, where a series of lectures were given broadly considering nuclear science and technology, and many of the themes were captured in a monograph I found in the library when I was a graduate student here. Shelley and all that. Mm-hmm. So it makes me think of a quote from our longest-lived lab director, Alvin Weinberger, who said that the price of a technologically advanced society is eternal vigilance. So you talked a lot about being more effective in our jobs at the end of your talk, but you didn't really tell us how to interact with technology more effectively. Do you have any insights into how we can more effectively manage our technological interface?
Wow, well, that's a question I can answer in 2 minutes, and here we go. So I think there's a couple of pieces. One, I did think about the nuclear piece in this story because I think you can't tell a story about fear and wonder in technology without also thinking about both the early days of radium in particular as one of the kind of the hypes. I mean, I think the Radium Girls as the kind of quintessential story about technology gone horribly wrong, right? And the hype curve out of control. And I think, you know, it's also important to know that one of the reasons we think the technology will kill us is that it has. It's not just Golem and Frankenstein, it's Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Maralinga in my part of the world where, you know, I do come from the only country where a different sovereign power detonated 5 nuclear weapons on our soil in peacetime. And we as citizens didn't know about it, and the indigenous people on whose land it happened knew nothing about it. So, you know, I think it's really hard to imagine that part of our fear is not also linked to the fact that we have seen the end point of certain scientific endeavors and it didn't always end well. So I think there's that piece that absolutely runs through this story. And I sometimes talk about radium in particular as part of that. I think how do we interact with machines more effectively is also a question that you would want to unpack. What does one mean by effective? I think, you know, there are notions about efficiency that are cultural and ideological as well as scientific. I think there are questions about what it is we hope machines will do for us and why that are also political questions, not just technical questions. I think in terms of how does one interact with technology better, from where I sit, it's about being critical. It's about asking all of those questions about why is a machine doing this? Why do we imagine a machine would do this? What is it we think is happening in that equation? And I think it's about paying attention and asking what are sometimes deeply discomforting questions. And then there's all the, you know, the stuff that, you know, I would tell you on a more practical level, back things up more often because no one ever does. Don't write down your passwords on bits of paper.
How's that going?
Well, so the average human being in the United States has 18 passwords and counting, And I would say, you know, probably they're all the same 18. We still know the two most popular passwords in the United States are password and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You know, the vast majority of human beings are not secure, and we know it. And no one backs up as much as they should.
Do you follow Star Trek?
Wow, not enough that I'm going to be good in the conversation that I know is about to follow.
Well,
Because the appropriate counter is, how are you on Blake 7? See, and no one in the room. That's so sad. British science fiction ever so much better. Nothing works. It's like Doctor Who, but better. Same Doctor Who writers. I'm sorry, yes, Star Trek.
In Star Trek: The Second Generation,
Oh,
the
God.
most frightening phrase that I heard in all of that was, "I am Locutus of the Borg." And that's when Picard is kidnapped by the Borg and incorporated into it.
Yes,
And to me, it was frightening because it's the fear of loss of identity. And I wonder how that figures into the whole thing of robots.
Okay, so that is actually a delightful question. And in fact, I do know that piece because Intel's running joke about itself, which is deeply telling, is of course a Star Trek one. And it is about assimilating into the Borg. And the thing they always say about me is that I have failed to assimilate into the Borg. 16 years and counting, I am awkwardly located on the outside of the Borg. So listen, interesting thing that happened on the sort of the fiction side of the scale in the last was the release of Spike Jonze's Her movie, the next in the long range of kind of prospective science fiction, so just over the horizon. And I think of it, if there's another couple of movies in that vein, it has moved the anxiety index in a different direction. So the Terminator sequence and all the movies like it were movies about the anxiety, an amplification of the anxiety about what it would mean to be replaced by machines. And they come out of a moment when Japanese car companies in particular were dominating the automotive industry, and the notion of being replaced by automation was a very real fear in a particular sector of the American economy. And those movies kind of took that and amplified it and riffed on hundreds of years of other anxieties, and were just, you know, dominant science fiction. Her as a movie, for those of you who haven't seen it, a film in which the protagonist installs a new computational artificial intelligence user interface in its life, goes in his ear. It has a woman's voice, it's Scarlett Johansson if you care, so you can have Scarlett Johansson in your ear, it's a good look. And this interface starts to become his everything, right? And ultimately he falls in love with the interface appears to fall in love with him until it becomes clear that she's actually having the same relationship with about 700 other people, and it becomes bored with him and leaves him, and he is heartbroken and devastated. Which is to suggest that where we once thought the machines would replace us, we now think the machines will just become bored with us and leave us. And that is a fear born of exactly what you said, of what does it mean to become so integrated into the technology that you can't imagine a life without it? What does it mean to be so known by Netflix, Amazon, and your bank that you never get to be you are merely a series of big data profiles? That movie is the manifestation of that set of anxieties. So, we're now going to move sideways in our fears from being killed to being made irrelevant or made less interesting. Because that's clearly one of the other riffs that runs through that, right, is it's just a series of data profiles. And at the point that we are all just big data profiles, that says something kind of dreadful about how we like to think about ourselves. Because that's the other fear that runs through all of this, not so much on the robotics side, but on the technology side, is that one of the things that frightens us about technology is that it suggests to us that we aren't special and that we aren't different and unique. And our fear is always about the centrality of us against a landscape of other. It's a deep answer, so there you go. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's a little past 11. Genevieve will be here for another few hours before we whisk her off to Gatlinburg, but she's going to be having lunch with women in computing. Yeah, we turn you off so you can't respond. No, so but so let's thank Genevieve for a very interesting.